Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to today's online event featuring Dr. Michelle Mullen, who will be speaking about thinking about ethics in the context of refugee experience, old tools, current challenges, and new possibilities, presented by N4, the National Newcomer Navigation Network. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that N4 recognizes and values the continued connections and our ongoing relationships with our Indigenous peoples in Canada. They're traditional stewards of this great land, which has become the home to a diverse population of other peoples. N4 is hosted at CHIO, which is housed on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, and for that we are thankful. My name is Mariah Maddock. I go by the pronoun she, her. I am a project coordinator with the National Newcomer Navigation Network and will be hosting today's webinar. My co-host, Andrew Tillmeyer, is an education coordinator with N4. Andrew will be monitoring the question and answer box today. And with that said, I am very pleased today to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Michelle Mullen. Dr. Mullen is a consultant bioethicist at CHIO, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, an associate professor of pediatrics at University of Ottawa. Dr. Mullen received her undergraduate training in human physiology and psychology at the University of Toronto, her master's degree in health policy from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and is the first doctoral graduate from the Joint Centre in Bioethics at the University of Toronto. She has numerous publications on bioethics issues related to women and children's health, genetics, clinical ethics and informed decisions, and public policy. Dr. Mullen's current research interests include method in bioethics and health policy, with a focus on transforming vulnerabilities, attention to voices historically silenced, truly informed decision-making, and healthcare outcomes and policy. And I just want to give a really warm welcome to Dr. Mullen and thank her very much for joining us today. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our N4 platform within 24 to 48 hours following today's presentation. Should any technical issues arise during this webinar, you will be informed with details for an alternate makeup session. And before we begin today's event, I would like to take a moment to introduce to you our platform features to help enhance your participation experience. Throughout today's session, we invite you to write your questions in the question and answer window. We will be monitoring these questions throughout the session today. And after Michelle's presentation, we will be posing some of these questions to her directly. And we know that sometimes many of you might have the same question or be interested in a specific response. So today you have the option of upvoting the questions, and we will prioritize which questions we asked first based on which ones are upvoted. And our speaker today has no conflicts of interest to declare. And with that said, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Mullen.
Thank you so much, Mariah, and thanks to all of you for joining me here today. You know, my work environment generally takes place within our healthcare system at CHIO, especially, and also within the university system. So this for me is a really exciting opportunity to share some of the tools of bioethics trade, so to speak, with really diverse colleagues that you are, who are engaged in such really important and exciting work. So I think it will be okay for technology because Mariah and Andrew are going to drive the bus, but be patient. I'll have them to sort me out if anything goes awry momentarily. So next slide. I'd like to start with a joke. You know, one of the major challenges in teaching ethics is this real tension between teaching what needs to be learned for qualifications and testing purposes, which is a kind of finite body, and what needs to be known in your real professional life. And unfortunately, they don't always jive together all that well. I would say, in my experience, almost inevitably, the truly challenging issues and situations that you face will not be those that are really all that well predicted by coursework or by textbooks, because straightforward ethical challenges tend to be those that we actually know what we should do about it. They're the subject of professional codes, for example, and there is a high degree of certainty about how we proceed. The really interesting ethical issues are those things that fall into the gray zone of really complex competing interests and values. And those are the sorts of issues that really confront our minds and our hearts not infrequently. So hence I picked this cartoon with a kind of lackluster response from an examining doctor saying, hey, I didn't learn that in school, so off you go. So nevertheless, recognizing that ethics is problematic, let's start this seminar by looking at some of the tools that are available to help us kind of start to consider issues and where they may help us and where sometimes they're not all that helpful. Next slide. Our objectives will be then first today to describe these more conventional approaches to managing ethical considerations and their usefulness and some limitations. A little further on, we'll describe in broad terms some of the more novel ethical challenges raised by working with potentially vulnerable communities, including refugee communities, and to introduce finally just the possibilities for maybe meeting these challenges in newer ways with the concepts of intersectionality and trauma-informed care. Next slide. But before we go much further, I'm going to ask you to engage in a little bit of a thought experiment to help get you thinking about how you and I and most of us make our moral and ethical decisions. So in most traditional models, including Kantian ethics of moral reasoning, there is the idea that there is some event that occurs. Pretend that someone suddenly swipes at my head and you see this. And then it's observed, you're the observer, perhaps by you. And then you quickly reflect on that, taking account of values and principles of laws and logic. And then you come to some kind of ethical decision, like perhaps a conclusion that someone ought not to have swiped at my head. So that's your decision. That's how people tend to believe they make decisions in this very linear, rational way. Unfortunately, there is an enormous body of research from a discipline known as moral psychology, which actually contradicts this. And most of us, although we think we do this, we don't. Next slide. The empirical observation, so when this is studied with folk, what we really find is that an event occurs, someone has smacked me, you've observed it, and immediately you make a decision about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. And then what we tend to do is to say, oh, post hoc, after the fact, to do a bit of analysis. Well, I said that was wrong, that's wrong because it shouldn't hurt people or it scared her or whatever it might be. And we confirm this very snap decision that we've made. So in moral psychology and in psychology generally, these kinds of very routine behaviors are called heuristics. And they're important and they're good things. For example, I know it's in an office these days, but if you're in an office and you're driving home at the end of the day, you might find that there's a whole lot of really itty little bit pieces in terms of getting into a car, opening it, unlocking it, starting it, checking your mirrors, exiting a parking lot, driving, stopping at lights, letting people cross, that you actually really don't think about because they are so rehearsed. They're heuristics. And, heuristics are good in many ways. They help us get through our day without having to considering every step of what we're going to do. However, in the context of making moral decisions, it can be dangerous to do this because we tend, all of us, to leap to decisions about what something means without actually understanding it. And a decision then governs our analysis of what we're doing. So in the example I just gave you, we might decide, oh, that was a terrible thing that just happened to Michelle. But in fact, if we kind of took it by steps and sought information, maybe we would find out that the person who smacked my head saw that there was like a lethal spider walking on my shoulder, and they did this to get rid of it and save my life. So we really need, and I hope you can kind of see where I'm going with this, to check ourselves when we have very, very rapid responses to something we witnessed. This is particularly important when we encounter people whose lives are different from us, whose life experience is different from us, as well as culture, historical, geopolitical factors that have made their experience and their being in the world quite different. We have to remember that the way we view things may be misguided, and we can wrongly ascribe meanings and values to what we see. So next slide. So some of you, I think, might be from healthcare backgrounds. I think I've lost a little bit of formatting here. And if you have been, or if you have been trained within any kind of healthcare sort of development at this point in history, you would almost certainly have been exposed to the principles of bioethics. And these are respect for persons. And I'll just comment that, in fact, this is often cited as respect for autonomy, but it was originally written as respect for persons with two parts, that we respect the autonomy of capable persons and that we protect vulnerable persons. So I work in pediatrics and with potentially vulnerable groups, so this is very important to me. Beneficence and non-maleficence are big kind of multisyllabic words, which you can use to intimidate people if you like, or just they really just mean a beneficence, that we try to do good, and non-maleficence, that we try to minimize harm so that the ratio of benefit to harm is reasonable. And then finally, justice, which means many things, and there is no overarching theory of justice, unfortunately, but minimally what all theories of justice share is the idea that you treat like cases alike and different cases differently. So what does that mean? It's very important in a lot of contexts, because what we have to decide when we're comparing cases is what's the relevant similarities to something we already know to be right or to be wrong, and what are the relevant differences. This is not all pie in the sky. This is the foundation of things like alternative justice systems, which we are experimenting with in this country. So those are the kind of famous Belmont principles. I don't know if you know, though, that these principles, and these have overtaken a lot of bioethics discourse around the planet, including what people put on exams as being testable. So they're worth knowing from that viewpoint. They're actually quite old. They're over 40 years old, and they arose out of a presidential commission in the United States, which was convened in the 1970s to address really quite terrible abuses of human subject research. And this was a subject, this human subject research had taken place in a plurality of environments, in industry, in medicine, psychology, in the military, in prisons. You can start to think about consent and those issues, and even some in residential facilities for disabled persons. So these so-called Belmont principles have had enormous influence on bioethics discourse. That said, one of the things you'll notice about these is that, or we can say about these, is that there's no Trump principle. That's a funny thing to say in the current context, but there's no principle which outweighs all the others. And they're not an algorithm to get a magical answer, and that's okay. But increasingly, in the past few decades, there has been criticism of these. One, because they are in fact, in some ways, quite American in that they are legalistic and they have a real tilt up toward making people responsible when they're sued for what happened. And they only reflect certain kinds of values and not a whole lot of other values. For example, values of family, values of community. So for my part, I think they're useful as signposts or things when we start to think about an issue, think about, well, where are persons situated? Are they vulnerable? Are they capable? What are the harms and benefits? You know, what seems fair? But they really are kind of limited in terms of what other things might be in our ethics toolkit. So secondly, critical theories, feminist ethics, and narrative ethics are some of the things which enrich our ability to consider ethical scenarios and challenges. And critical theories and feminist theories really are those whereby one is required first and foremost, if you're participating in an ethical discussion, to be kind of really transparent and clear about to yourself and to others as required about your own values, your own position, and what you are bringing to the discussion. And so critical theories also, including feminist ethics, tend to have a particular set of values that they think are, that they assert are important. In feminist ethics, and there are many theoretical feminist ethics, but what they all share is the idea that if you have a society where there is discrimination or marginalization or oppression or any of those things you can think of, which happens on identifiable characteristics like gender, like socioeconomic status, ethnicity, language, ability, sexual orientation, and so forth, then you can't have a just society. So that's something that one can bring explicitly to a discussion. And I find particularly in the arena of pediatrics, where many of those things are operational issues of age, issues of social status, issues of ability. So, very important lenses to bring. And in conjunction with that, narrative ethics, which can mean, again, many, many things. This is a huge discipline, but minimally, narrative ethics is concerned with the story and who gets to tell the story, what is the record of it, what's the dominant story, issues of power, issues of who has voice and who can be silenced. So, as an example, I sometimes think that in healthcare we have a record. It's used to be paper, now it's electronic, of what's happening with a patient. And they tend to be very technical for the most part. If you have someone in an intensive care unit, we talk about what drugs have been administered, what their vital signs were like, what additional things needed to be done, what x-rays or other imaging was taken. But for the patient in the bed and for the family sitting with them, that's not their story. Their story is a story of experiencing illness or experiencing the illness or frailty of someone who they love very much. And if it's someone who's looking at their child, their story is, will my child survive? Will my child be, have permanent losses because of this? Who's going to look after my kids tonight if I have to stay here all night? What am I going to do with my job? So there are many, many things in that story that, in fact, we don't capture in the official record. And we need to think about those because those are the things that often become the substrate of ethical challenges. What's actually, everyone's talking about their story, but no one's talking about the same thing. Casuistry is, just quickly, it's a medieval approach to trying to come to an understanding of an ethical case by comparing it to cases that you or society has already worked out. So, really the take-home message there is don't forget what we've learned before. And finally, I'll just put a plug here to say that some of you, I'm sure, have seen in the press, the kind of this resurgence of interest or this sudden interest in ethics because of the pandemic around issues of, certainly resource allocation, who gets a vaccine, who will or will not get a space in an intensive care unit or a ventilator and so forth. And though you might see where some of those concerns around story and around identifiable characteristics of vulnerability really play into it. And so we, come up more publishing, the ministry's using this thing or the other thing, these, long, complicated values, which are important and interesting, but kind of hard to know in the day what they really mean. And I just think if you're really stuck and in a hurry, look at best evidence, because really science alone doesn't guarantee good ethics, but you need it. You can't do good ethics unless you actually know what you're talking about. So we use best evidence and we use social justice. And it actually, if you can just anchor your thinking to those things in a crunch, it takes you potentially quite far. So next slide. That was a long one. I'm just going to mention, and I think it's really important, people are sometimes not really aware of this or not explicitly thinking about it, but like kind of traditional medical ethics or nursing ethics would happen at the bedside. And you can call that microethics because it's basically between a practitioner and or a team and one person or family. But those situations are embedded in institutions which have their own ethical responsibilities around resources, around labor issues, around supports of various communities, many fundraising, many things. So there is a locus, or a sphere of consideration of ethical issues for institutions. And finally, there are macroethics. So these are the things that happen within the larger social sphere. They reflect sometimes the values of people, although we have a very pluralistic society. So how are our values actually manifest? They're manifest through things like laws. So we say that certain things are criminal offenses, so we don't do those. So that's kind of macroethics. We have other policies. Some important ones in your sphere would be human rights policies and institutions. And we also have, I like to say, follow the money. One of the most powerful reflections of our values, I think, is, follow the dollars. Where do we spend money? And we do like to talk about looking after vulnerable people, described in many ways. But when you sort of follow the funding envelopes, is that really what's happening? So the point here is that if you're at the bedside or at the desk side, depending on, or the curbside, depending on what your role is, and that microethics, whether you appreciate it or not on a given day, are trying to sort that out within the context of your institution or your organization and in the larger social sphere. So they have often different concerns and different lenses, these three levels, and the decision they make about a particular issue might be conflict from one to another. So really interesting and challenging for people working with real humans on the ground is to remember where their fiduciary relationship is. And that's a kind of first and foremost with the person, the client or patient and community in front of them, but also that they have obligations and they are also constrained often by institutional and social ethics. So to bear in mind. Next slide. Also some formatting there too, sorry. So I also just wanted to mention, because it came up as one of the foundations for why this is all happening, kind of the foundation for informed decision making. And I'll say up front that you might have thought that I'd say informed consent, but because I'm an ethicist, I think, an informed decision is one that could go one way or the other. So what it requires is really disclosing, and whether it's disclosing what a process is. For example, if you were working in some area of social services about how someone would qualify for something, or in a healthcare field, an intervention or a diagnostic. So you have to disclose the nature of that thing. Like, you'll have to go here and fill out these forms, or you would have to have these injections or whatever it might be. The risks and benefits of that and the foreseeable consequences. And what the alternatives are, their risks and benefits, and their foreseeable consequences. And that actually falls under a Supreme Court decision in this country, that's actually the standard for disclosure. The second element, and this is a really tough one sometimes, is of informed decision making, is understanding. So if we say a whole lot of things to a client or a patient, and they really don't, we're inaccessible and they don't understand really the substance of anything we're saying, then it's not valid informed decision making because they don't understand. Determining how someone understands, or if they understand, is really tricky, because you don't want to be patronizing and insult people. You always want to be respectful. So if you start asking them questions as though they, like doing a school test, that can be really objectionable to people, or many people, or even kind of frightening. So I have found in my practice that, understanding and doing a check on understanding is actually giving lots of opportunities for your client or your patient to ask you a question and say, so I've just said this, did that make sense to you? Or rather than kind of putting onto a school test. The third element is capacity. And capacity is a very small, narrow legal an ethical concept, which only means the thing, you only have it for the thing we're talking about today. So capacity means that you actually are able to understand the nature of what's being talked about or proposed, its risks and benefits and foreseeable consequences. In the healthcare context, it's really important to know, and especially in pediatrics where kids are moving along a developmental continuum, people can have capacity for some kinds of decisions and not for others. So that's something that when we connect with people, and certainly within the healthcare realm, all healthcare providers are meant both to assume capacity. In Ontario, the law is very clear on that, and also to be assessing it at the same time, because it can change because of accident or illness or any number of things from moment to moment. There are some differences on capacity. In Ontario, there's no age of capacity, and there's assumption of that. There are some regional differences, so depending on where you work, you should do a check-in on legal requirements in your territory or in your state about the legal standard for capacity. Voluntariness is an ugly-looking word, but really just means that we're not meant to coerce people. And this is really challenging sometimes because many of us are working in health or social services or social justice because we want to make things better for people. And sometimes we have a deep sense of what that should look like. So it's really, really personally challenging to check that and allow people to make voluntary decisions. And in the course of time, and we all have, and I don't know that there's anyone here, certainly in my life, I've sometimes made some spectacularly bad decisions, which I look back and go, what on earth was I thinking? We all have to have the opportunity to make what might be mistakes. And we all have to have the opportunity to make choices that someone else wouldn't make, but prove to be the right choice for us. So really one of those challenges, especially sometimes when you care a lot, is to ensure that people are working in this voluntary sphere. Really important when to remember this in an underlying sort of way, when working with groups who may have been manipulated, who have fears and so forth, and who have a sense of vulnerability. We start to address some of that by respecting their agency. And finally, at the end of this process, you can have an informed consent or a refusal. Have to remember that it is at a point in time, getting a signature, that's what we do a lot in healthcare, on a page. That's one step, but consent can be withdrawn at any time. It can be reconsidered at any time. And, we need to know that it really reflects a process and not a finite event. And I'll just kind of note that there is, in some environments, concern with assent, which is something which may apply to a person, and healthcare is my environment, where they lack the capacity for a decision about something, so that has gone to a substitute decision maker, for example, a parent or a spouse, or another family member. And we have to ask ourselves whether assent is appropriate. And assent is really to get the permission of the person who lacks capacity to participate in what we're doing. Candidly, my view on this is that we should only talk about assent if we're going to honor it. And I sometimes encounter situations where people are, want, to do something, get small children to sign a paper, and it's like, if we're going to go ahead and give them this operation, whether they sign or not, I'm not sure why we're doing it, because I think if you're offering assent, you have to accept that that person might decline. They might say, no, I don't want to do that. And then we have to be okay, because we take a lot away from people when we say, oh, do you want us to do this? And they say no, and we go ahead and do it anyway. This is clearly not the best way to go. So next slide, please. Kind of move this into your milieu. I just wanted to make some notes about newcomers, new Canadians. And I'll say that in 2019, where we have StatsCan has the numbers, Canada took in excess of 30,000 refugees, some government assisted, some privately sponsored, and within that mix, there were some atypical, so-called atypical migrants, asylum seekers, and undocumented. And through routine immigration in the same period, more than 300,000. So, you know, Canada is a place where, and to our credit, I think, we recognize, I think, the great value that newcomers and diverse populations bring to our country, and just how much of our history is so much the richer for that. Now, what I did want to say here is that my video keeps looking at there. Just this week, the UN announced that in 2020, less than 30,000 refugees were settled worldwide. And of course, that's because of the pandemic. And I will return to this idea because it is true that vulnerable folk are most hurt by conditions of stress in our society. And it is something that's a social justice question we need to ask ourselves. Next slide. So out of all this, to decide where this conversation ought to go, I was provided with this great information. These are ethical issues that were identified in newcomer navigation through the enforced site visits, the results, and there were 4 main areas. I don't know why my video keeps disappearing, sorry. The first was around consent and capacity, elements of informed consent and how do you assure it for newcomers, which is why I spent a bit of time talking about that. The second item noted is interesting. It was around delivering bad news, with the absolutely appropriate observation that the way in which you deliver bad news can exacerbate the effects or reduce the effects of that disappointment or that difficult story. And what are the understandings and tools for this? And I want to point out, this is a hugely important question about how we deliver bad news, and absolutely delivering news in a ham-handed way, which is not supportive and which harms people, is unethical. But it's not per se an ethical question. When we have bad news that people need, we have to deliver it. And this is actually a communications question rather than being ethically problematic. And so this is kind of just where we need to direct our energies on it, but also a point about sometimes people can have the experience of like, well, this doesn't, you know, seem right, like we need to do an ethical analysis. But in fact, what we don't, sometimes we just feel badly about sad or difficult things. And that is part of the work we do. So really, just to flag this is actually a communications piece. It would be unethical to do this in a cruel way, deliver bad news, but it's not ethically problematic. In contrast, the way that we prioritize resources and services, for example, setting caps on services or resources, it is a fundamental and recurring issue for ethicists and for all of us working in any area, whether it's education, healthcare, settlement of folk. There's never enough resources to do what we really want to do. And how do we decide on service limitations? This is congruent with what I was saying earlier about how will we decide about who gets a vaccine first, where is it most efficacious, who's most vulnerable, who will, who will not receive services like intensive care or ventilator assistance if they're very, very ill. So This is a hard question. This is kind of one of the million-dollar questions. And really what it is about is finding one of those models. And if you recall, I said there's no overarching theory of justice. And so we've tried to find ways. People will argue for different kinds of ways of allocating scarce resources. Some argue it should be done on a first come, first served basis, although you can see that sometimes there's inherent problems in that, because the person who got there first may not need the service nearly so much as a person who arrived, 10th down the line. We might do it on the basis of greatest needs. That's something that we tend to do in healthcare with allocating a really scarce resource, which are solid organs for transplantation. And there's some rationale to that. One of the questions about that is whether if it goes to the person with greatest need and their chances of survival are quite slim, does that turn out to be not an effective use of that very scarce, for example, kidney or heart or liver? Or some people say that a lottery system would be the best way to do this. In other countries, at least around healthcare resources or core healthcare resources, this is not true in Canada, but some people actually apply a kind of liberal market model, saying if you can afford to pay for it, then you buy it. So that overall is not the framework we bring in Canada, and I think that that is an appropriate thing. But nonetheless, we don't have a magical way to work out these questions. And sorry, I'm having strange things happen on my screen. And there tends to be a kind of negotiation process between things like first come, first serve, greatest need, random allocation. And we see that actually just recently with vaccines, that we have been allocating where need is great in those communities. That's been the effort, and for those who are providing service. And where there have been leftovers in vials, then there's been lists in institutions where people are just randomly called. So often we can do kind of hybrid models of this. And finally, and this is a big issue in particular communities, privacy and confidentiality. And this is a final item which had been noted by the N4 site visits. That within a smaller subset of community newcomers, there are those who may have concerns about their privacy and confidentiality, and this can prove to be a barrier to accessing services or disclosure. So what can you do to provide this? So I think, we do our utmost to protect privacy and confidentiality, and we need, in some way, resources can help with this, because cultural and linguistic translation in a very small community where there are few players can be a source of where this can become a problem. So we need to direct our resources and choose wisely around that. And we also have to be very clear when we're dealing with patients, families, clients about legal limitations to privacy and confidentiality. For example, child protection or any situation where there might be a perceived harm to others. So I'm going to take a wide left turn here and start talking about a little bit about how we might think about consent differently. And I want to just tell you a little bit of the story of VFFS, which is video fluoroscopic feeding studies. And these are something, this is a tool which is very commonly used in pediatrics, where there's a risk that a child or a youth may have poor feeding, maybe they're not getting enough, that they don't have the kind of motor skills in their throat to be swallowing easily, that there's choking or coughing, that they might be at risk for what we call an aspiration pneumonia, where food goes into the lung, or they have frequent respiratory tract infections, or other disorders that might lead them into this potentially dangerous situation around eating or not getting enough nutrition. So common study, but we encountered from a couple of communities, some refugee communities, and also some of our patients from the very far north, who we see people who are sort of in hospital. And feeding study is shorthand to healthcare professionals who work in pediatrics. It's like, oh, we'd like your kid to do a feeding study. Is that okay? Sure, we'll do a feeding study. It's really just an X-ray, and off they go. And this kind of more complicated test happens. And next slide. Could I have the next slide? Yeah. There are outcomes which may eventuate depending on the results of a feeding study. So, you might be told to alter diet, food consistency from coarse to fine to make it more, or vice versa, to make it safer to swallow, changes of posture, supplemental feedings, all the way through to artificial nutrition and hydration, either partial or full. And these are surgical interventions to allow feedings. And we had lots of problems because this really upset people. Clearly, we were not connected to many social and cultural meanings of food. Personal narratives, for example, I recall a case where a family with a very medically complex child who had a very, very difficult literal journey to Canada, and had given tremendously fantastic care to their child, always managed to feed them. And now they're being told, no, we got to give you a different way to feed the kids. So it also made us think about, is our feeding study something without error, without limitations? And of course, when you look at it critically, it's not. There's, we have narrower grounds now for who we might recommend this test for, but we struck a multidisciplinary group which looked at this issue for well over a year to try and come up with a better way to really look critically at our practices and also to communicate better so that people could make more authentic consent. And next slide. So this is something that you could find if you went to the CHEO public website, cheo.on.ca, and you would see under feeding studies and in multiple languages. The one in the center there is actually in Arabic, and it is a long video explaining exactly all the steps, all the rationale, and all the outcomes that might come from a feeding study. And we have really turned a corner in our ability to communicate with people by trying to understand or seeking their expertise in their own culture, about meanings of foods, about how things done. I'm just being told I've only got a few minutes. So I think it's a great step. It's just a great step. We can do better. It is uninformed consent. It's lots of work. Next slide. Another example at CHEO, which I'm just peripherally involved in now to think differently about consent. We have these wonderful young pediatric residents, Doctors John Ramsey and Jen DeCan, and their supervisor, Alessandra Rossi Ricci, who are looking at, in fact, barriers to primary care access as people enter the emergency department looking for services. Next slide. And rather than simply getting a paper, which is always what happens when people, they're very concerned, and we've come up with this way, they've come up with this beautiful way, and we're going to be actually, as a sub-study, assessing how effective this is of having staged consent, starting with one part identifying possible participants and what it might mean in the emergency department, and then a pre-interview with a co-investigator, always a certified translator, verbal and paper versions. A post-interview, can we, continue with this? Or if there's something in a discussion a participant wants to rescind, we will do that. And then finally, before publication, there will be an invitation to read and discuss the final reports and comment and agree on the interpretation. Next slide. So really something which moves into a far richer area but lots of work. It's more work to do authentic consent. I've mentioned COVID a few times, and I think amongst all the other things we're learning with COVID is certainly that all these things like race, indigeneity, ability, gender, SES, food security, and the role of bioethics. These are key issues for us to take going forward. We've really seen how the pressures which we're all feeling are so disproportionately affecting marginalized folk. Next slide. Quickly, emerging tools that may help us. Intersectionality, which is an analytical framework, which really looks at how identifiable social and political identities, gender, ethnicity, so forth, give rise to marginalization and discrimination and privilege too, with a way to mitigate those things, and also trauma-informed care with its 4 assumptions, the 4 R's, a realization about the impact, which can be so phenomenal on persons and groups, recognizing the signs of trauma, a system which responds to this, and finally resisting re-traumatizing people by our intervention, no matter how well intentioned. Next slide. This just quickly, if you were going to read one thing after all this, this is in JAMA, this is Donald Barrick, a paper on 1 page on the moral determinants of health, came out in 2020. This will be posted, but I would highly recommend that you have a read of it if you have the opportunity. Looking at issues of systemic racism, about the things we really need to address. Next slide. Along the way, and this is really important, I'm sorry that I've become crunched for time. As you do your own practice, this is what they tell us in the airlines, those if I've been on a plane, but secure your own mask first. So we do need to look after ourselves. We need to take care of ourselves because we are valuable unto ourselves, but also because you are important parts of the system that you work in. So if I could have the next slide. Pay attention to the moral distress that you might experience in the ethical work you do. And that's the psychological state where what you might be perceiving as ethically correct is different from what you are asked, tasked, or able to do. The cost can be phenomenal in terms of psychological and mental health, and attrition from positions and professions. It's very significant in staff retention. And really, we need to think about moral resilience. And that's a self-regulation and self-awareness that helps us identify, inquire, and negotiate steps. And sometimes, if we have moral distress, one of the best things to do that, rather than experience cognitive dissonance, is to translate this into advocacy for the things that we already feel really passionately about. Next slide. So quickly, take-home messages. When you're thinking about ethical issues, think of benefits, risks, burdens, writ large, so not just a little narrow medical or administrative piece, but what this means for persons. Look at your patient or your client, their family, their healthcare team, and the communities that you're involved with. Remember, there are overarching values and social standards, including the legal standards, and there's professional obligations. Your professions can be sources of information and support for you. Please consider intersectional issues and trauma with these populations we're working with. And it seems like hard work, but it's actually quite exciting to start to develop a somewhat self-critical stance, because it allows us to see the great potential in our newcomers and the privilege of the work we do as we move forward, and we bring some humility, and we're able to learn from the terrific newcomers and other populations we work with. So I think I'll take the next slide. This will just be posted. It's slightly adapted to the CHIO bioethics framework, just to a little bit of some steps to consider. For sure, look for support from your peers and your advocates and your mentors and experts. Next slide. Next slide. And there'll be some resources posted. And next slide. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry I galloped through there, but I appreciate your participation.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And I noticed your video's just going on and off, so maybe just try to stop your video and we'll try turning it on. But thank you so much for that really informative presentation. And thank you for making reference to some of the things we've observed as the N4 team has done our outreach and engagement through our site visits. And we do have some questions in the chat for you. So I'm just going to go to the Q&A box, and I encourage anyone to keep your questions coming. Our first question is, what are your thoughts on families who decline an interpreter out of pride, um, but we're not sure they understand, or those who, out of concern for confidentiality, want to use a family member for interpretation?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I don't, and I think there's sometimes some context in that sort of situation. So one has to sometimes weigh if we kind of insist on something right now, like the value had better be there because there's a good chance we lose someone, not just for this scenario, right? But for an indefinite amount of time, if not forever, including, their children or other people in their community. So, I always think the negotiation of baby steps is, and we teach people about our needs, right? As our needs in terms of, it is my job. I'm in trouble if I don't tell you these things, and I need to know they're told you. We can also explore other options. And, one of the other great benefits of COVID, boy, we have Zoom now. We have Zoom so that we can actually find translation resources. And I think that's something that they have to be built, but that is certainly an area where we can do lots of work. But, if you're going to kind of come down hard-handed on insisting on something, then you have to be prepared for the worst outcome and make sure it's justifiable, which is you might lose someone entirely. I don't know if that helps. Okay, I'm not hearing you.
And our next, sorry about that, I was muted. Our next question is, in terms of giving bad news, in some cultures, family members don't want you to tell the patient the actual diagnosis. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish we had time for that to do it in a more fulsome way. I'll say quickly that in those cultures, and there is empirical evidence at which we can tell people, we can teach people this, that when people aren't told things, they actually know what's going on, but no one will talk to them about it. And there's some great work done some years ago out of Italy, because that was kind of codified practice in the hospitals, that no one would tell a patient they were dying. But they were in the hospital, the whole family would come every day, bring all this food, cry and stuff. So of course, the person in the bed knew they were dying, but no one would talk to them, and it's actually isolated. So you need to talk to people about these sorts of things, and you can always take it back to, again, in terms of your responsibilities, to a patient, say, when people want to handle bad news differently, or sometimes there's difficult news. How do you want that to happen? Because your primary responsibility is to the patient in that situation in front of you. This is also a question we face with non-newcomer families, for example, parents who just don't want their child to know that they have a very serious illness or situation that they're dealing with. So great question, but again, baby steps can go a long way with this, and helping to inform people about what it really means for the person who's not being told, what is the real messaging there, and what our obligations are as well.
And we have another question in the chat. Thank you for that. Can you have fully informed and voluntary consent when using a translator, coming from an immigrant refugee that does not speak English? And then the second part of that question is, what are the steps that can be taken to assure that they fully understand the procedure and its risks, the research you are doing, etc.?
Yeah, these are all the big questions. Good group. So, the reason we have ethical kind of moral distress, is that these things are hard to do well. And so we kind of do our best. We are working on, for example, the barriers to primary care study that we're doing at CHIO. We'll actually be specifically looking at some of those steps to improve our informed consent process. We think there is a perfect informed consent process yet, but I know that the worst ones are when we stick a piece of paper in front of someone's face and, get them to sign it. And then what does that mean anyway? So iterative steps, rehearsing, and really being honest, because boy, it's hard, because it's hard to recruit people to studies, right? and a lot of our careers, and we have interests that are vested in that, and that's part of being self-critical. What do we bring to the table here? But despite that, to put their interests first and give people opportunities in a really a genuine way to rescind or alter their participation.
Great, and I just see one other question here in the chat. Thank you for the presentation. It was really informative. And just to let everyone know, we will make a recording of this available on the N4 platform within 24 to 48 hours following the presentation, and that will also include a transcript. And I just want to give a big thanks to you, Dr. Mullen, for taking time to participate today and answer questions. And thanks to everyone who has joined us from across Canada. Following today's session, we will have a survey. We invite you to complete this. This helps us continuously improve our webinars and the content. And as well, when this is posted, we will move any kind of unanswered questions or any lingering questions to our platform's meeting place. If you are not currently a member, you can become one at www.newcomernavigation.ca, and there's no cost to join. And I'm just going to turn it to Michelle. Do you have any final words for the group today?
No, I just really, I think it would be, thank you so much for your interest. I know everyone is so busy right now, and there are many stresses in all of our lives. And, to be, as much as we're asked to be patient with the folk you work with, to, be, critical, self-critical, but to also be kind to yourself, because, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, the work you do. And, I just applaud you for your commitment to doing better with these terrific folk who've come to our shores. So thank you for being here.
Okay, thanks again, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at another online N4 event. Stay safe and be well.